All right, in this section of our notes, we're going to be talking about carbohydrates, which is one type of organic molecule. We've already learned a little bit about carbohydrates. We said that they are commonly known as sugars, and they are built of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, like C6H12O6. Now, when you see the names of carbohydrates, lots of times they're going to end in "-ose". That's not always the case, but that's a pretty common ending for your carbohydrates. Now, when it comes to your carbs, you might think of there are small carbs, a little bit larger, and then there's really, really big carbs. Now, the small molecules are called the monosaccharides. Now, monosaccharides look like hexagons or pentagons. But instead of drawing those shapes, I'm just going to represent them as like a little circle. So monosaccharides are just one small molecule, like you see here, glucose, fructose, and galactose. But we can take them and we can put them together, and that's going to create bigger carbohydrates. So this would be a disaccharide. Remember, di means 2, mono means 1. And then we have polysaccharides, and poly means many. So if you have a molecule that is several monosaccharides long, then that's going to be your polysaccharide. Now, since we use those monosaccharides to build the disaccharides, we call monosaccharides the monomers of carbs. Remember, monomers are the small molecules that we chain together to make bigger ones. So here we can take a look at those structures, and we've got our monosaccharides like glucose, fructose, and galactose. We'll talk more about them. Your disaccharides, again, are made by linking 2. So let's take a look at sucrose here. Sucrose is a disaccharide. If you link together a glucose and a fructose, then we have a different sugar. We have a disaccharide, which is called sucrose. Here's another disaccharide, lactose. You probably heard of lactose. It's the sugar that's in milk. If we take glucose and link it together with a galactose, then we have that disaccharide, which is lactose. Now, one thing I want to point out is in all of these molecules that we're talking about, glucose is in all of them. So notice in sucrose, we have glucose. In lactose, we have glucose. And then these polysaccharides are also made of glucose molecules that are bonded together. And I'm just showing you a small part of it, but note that these glucoses keep going and keep going in these different molecules. And again, polysaccharides are made by linking 3 or more monosaccharides together. In this case, it's glucose that you need to make cellulose and starch and glycogen. Now, notice when we get to our polysaccharides, we start using other words than ose, but they're still carbohydrates. So let's take, again, a closer look at these monosaccharides and some of the things that I would expect you to know about them. Again, they are the smallest molecules, and we've already learned that they're built of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Now, we can call them simple sugars, and the reason why is whenever you taste them, they will taste sweet. So any food that you taste, if it's sweet, then you say it contains simple sugars. Now, some details that I would expect you to remember about these monosaccharides. You might remember fructose, or have heard of fructose, because of high fructose corn syrup. Fructose is a monosaccharide that we can mass produce here in the Midwest because we can grow a lot of corn. And fructose is a simple sugar used to sweeten many of our processed foods, such as sodas and candy and baked goods and ketchup. But if you think about it, fructose also sounds like fruit. Plants produce fructose and they store it in the fruit, and that's why oftentimes that fruit is sweet, because it has a lot of fructose in it. Now let's look down here a little bit, because we've already mentioned that fructose is an important monosaccharide that is used to build bigger carbohydrates. So again, monosaccharides are the monomers. Small molecules we're going to bond together to make bigger ones. So again, to make sucrose, this is where we need a glucose and a fructose. So if you take a monomer or a monosaccharide and another monomer or monosaccharide, bonded together, then you get that disaccharide. Now, the reason why I have to teach you about galactose as a monomer and a monosaccharide is for this little fact right here. If we want to build milk sugar, which is a disaccharide, we need glucose, and fructose won't work. So galactose is the second simple sugar used to build that disaccharide, lactose. Now, let's go back up here and let's talk about glucose. And you've studied glucose before because you've studied photosynthesis, and here's your equation for glucose. So glucose is primarily the sugar that's made by plants during photosynthesis. And since there's such an abundance of it, you can see that glucose is found in many different bigger molecules, which we'll see here in just a second. One thing I want you to understand about glucose is that glucose is considered the food for all living things, but glucose, the food, contains energy that's not usable by cells. So all organisms have the ability to take that glucose and break it down, release the energy, and that's why we say that organisms use glucose for energy. They're going to take that glucose, break it down, release that energy, and that allows cells to make ATP. ATP is a usable form of chemical energy. So let's indicate it's a usable form of chemical energy, but glucose is needed in order to produce that ATP. All right, let's take a look at our next page here. As I mentioned, we've already talked about the disaccharides, so I'm just going to go over some of this stuff briefly. It's made by linking two monosaccharides together, and we've learned in the past that when you hook two monomers together, that's called dehydration synthesis. Do you see how we're going to remove two H's and an O? And so when we do that, let's show that water is being removed, and now these two monomers can be bonded together here. Just like your monosaccharides, disaccharides can also be called simple sugars because they're going to taste sweet. And speaking of sweet, the table sugar that you use, or the sugar that you use to bake cookies or sweeten your tea or make your Kool-Aid, is most likely sucrose. So sucrose is your typical table sugar, and it's made by sugarcane plants. Again, how it's made, they make glucose, they make fructose, and they bond it together, and that makes the sucrose. Now let's talk a little bit more about lactose, the disaccharide. It is found in milk. And you've probably heard a little bit about lactose before because some people are lactose intolerant. So what that means is if they are lactose intolerant, whenever they drink milk, that lactose exists as a disaccharide. So it's got a glucose hooked together with a galactose. And now it is called lactose. And if you're lactose intolerant, you can't digest this molecule. You can't break up the lactose into glucose and galactose. And when it stays as a disaccharide, it can have a tendency to upset your stomach. So we say that you are lactose intolerant if you no longer make the protein or the enzyme that can digest the lactose into two monomers. All right, moving on to our polysaccharides here. Poly means many. Now, let's add 3 or more. They are not sweet, and that's why we call them complex sugars. So if you're eating food that has complex sugars, it's not going to taste sweet, such as your pastas or rice or potatoes, but they are carbohydrates. And what those carbohydrates, those complex sugars, are made out of is glucose. So each little circle right here is a glucose monomer. So you can see glycogen is made of lots of glucoses. We've got cellulose is made of glucoses, just arranged in a different way. And then starch is also made of glucoses. So you can see if you arrange them in different ways, you can build different polysaccharides. Now let's talk about the two that are related to plants. Remember, plants are spending all day doing photosynthesis. They make the glucose. Well, they don't need to take all the glucose and turn it into ATP at that moment. Sometimes they need to store it for further time. For example, If they're at nighttime, they don't make any glucose, but they have it stored so they can still make their ATP. So plants take their glucose, and I'm just going to kind of emphasize that the starch molecule here is just made of thousands of glucose molecules strung together. So those are all glucose monosaccharides. And when they're all together a certain way, then we say it's starch. So we say starch is stored energy for plants, because when they need glucose, then they can hydrolyze, break off these glucose molecules from the big starch molecule, and they can use the glucose. Now, because again, they're making so much glucose during the day, there's an excess of it, and so they make their starch, but they can also take that glucose and build other polysaccharides. So when you look at plant cell walls, so let's indicate that that is a cell wall. It is made of cellulose. Let's put a cellulose cell wall. And so that's added protection for that plant cell. Now let's go over here, because this is when we're dealing with animals. And just like plants, sometimes we have an excess of glucose and we need to store it for later on when we haven't eaten in a while. So again, every single monosaccharide in this molecule of glycogen is glucose. So we can take our extra glucose molecules, string them together, and that is how we store our glucose for later on when needed. So we say that animal cells make glycogen, and again, that is just a way for them to store their excess glucose. There are some other things that we can do with excess glucose. Some organisms use the glucose and string it together to make a molecule that's called chitin. And that is what the exoskeleton, so this outside shell part of insects or even arthropods like lobsters and crabs, they are made of chitin. So you might remember a crunchy chitin, because if you step on a bug, it's going to crunch. And that exoskeleton is made of that polysaccharide. Okay. Last thing we're going to take a look here is, again, carbs in food. And if you are eating simple sugars like glucose, fructose, sucrose, then those foods are going to taste sweet. Now, we want to make sure that we limit the amount of simple sugars. If we are going to eat sweet stuff, we want to try to make sure that we're eating something that has additional nutrients in it. So the best types of carbs that we would want to eat that have simple sugars would be like fruit, because it has other vitamins and minerals in it that you can use. Remember, complex carbs aren't going to taste sweet, like bread and rice and pasta. These release the glucose a little bit slower into our digestive system, into our bloodstream. And so then we don't get so much of a sugar rush there in our bloodstream. So those are what we mean by complex carbs. And again, they are containing glucose and giving you glucose, but just not as quickly as if we eat those foods that have those simple sugars in them. And that concludes our notes on carbs.